Hi, my name is Nathan, and I'm from Thailand. Years ago, my spoken English was far from fluent. I struggled a lot with expressing myself clearly and confidently in English. It was a frustrating experience, especially since I was living in Thailand, where opportunities to practice speaking English with native speakers were limited. But over time, I found a way to improve my spoken English dramatically, and I managed to become fluent without ever leaving Thailand. The methods I used to achieve this can be done at home, from anywhere in the world. In this video, I'm going to share those methods with you so you can improve your spoken English as well. The journey might not be easy, but it is certainly achievable, and I am living proof of that. So, let's dive in. The most important secret. The first thing I want to share with you is the most important secret to speaking English well. This secret isn't something you hear very often, but it's absolutely crucial if you want to become fluent. The secret is this: to speak English fluently, you need to build unconscious knowledge in English. Let me emphasize that again because it's vital to your success. If you want to speak English fluently, you need a high level of unconscious knowledge in English. But what exactly is unconscious knowledge? Well, unconscious knowledge is the ability to do something without having to think about it consciously. It's the ability to perform a task automatically without needing to focus your attention on it. For example, think about activities like riding a bicycle, playing a musical instrument, or speaking your native language. When you ride a bicycle, you don't have to think about how to move your legs or how to balance. It happens automatically. Similarly, when you play a musical instrument with enough practice, your hands and fingers move across the instrument without you needing to consciously think about every movement. This automatic, effortless execution is what I mean by unconscious knowledge. Unconscious knowledge in language learning. Now let's consider how unconscious knowledge applies to language learning. Think about how you speak your first language. When you talk in your native language, do you consciously think about grammar rules? Do you pause to think about sentence structure or syntax before you speak? No, you don't. And yet, every sentence you speak is grammatically correct, or at least it makes sense within the context of your conversation. You're not actively thinking about grammar, but somehow everything you say is in line with the rules of your language. Why is that? It's because you have a high level of unconscious knowledge in your native language. This is the key reason why you can speak it fluently and effortlessly. Your brain has internalized the grammar, vocabulary, and structures of your language to the point where they are automatic. You don't have to think about them because your brain handles these tasks unconsciously. So if you want to speak English fluently, you need to increase your unconscious knowledge of English. Once you achieve this, speaking English will feel as natural and automatic as speaking your first language. It will flow out of you effortlessly without requiring you to consciously think about the rules of the language. Why unconscious knowledge is hard to acquire. Now, you might be wondering how to acquire this unconscious knowledge. Unfortunately, this is where things get a bit challenging. The truth is that this type of knowledge cannot be taught in the traditional sense. It's not something you can learn by reading grammar books, attending classes, or watching grammar lessons on YouTube. These activities can help you acquire conscious knowledge, knowledge that you are aware of and that you have to think about to use. But conscious knowledge is not what you need to speak fluently. Conscious knowledge is the kind of knowledge where you have to think about grammar rules and syntax as you speak. You might know all the rules about tenses, prepositions, and sentence structures, but when it comes time to have a conversation, you have to pause and think about how to apply those rules. This kind of knowledge is slow, deliberate, and quite frankly, not very useful in real-time conversations. When you're in a conversation, you don't have the luxury of time to think about grammar. If someone asks you a question, you need to respond quickly. You don't have time to pause, think about the correct tense or preposition, and then formulate your answer. You need to be able to respond immediately and naturally. This is where unconscious knowledge comes into play. It allows you to speak without needing to consciously think about the language. The role of conscious and unconscious parts of the brain in language. Speaking a language involves two parts of the brain, the conscious part and the unconscious, automatic part. When you speak your first language, the conscious part of your brain focuses on the information you want to communicate, what you want to say, the ideas you want to express. Meanwhile, the unconscious part of your brain takes care of the grammar, vocabulary, and sentence structure. This coordination between the conscious and unconscious parts of your brain allows you to speak fluently and naturally. If you want to say something in your native language, you can just say it. You don't have to consciously think about how to form the sentence, what tense to use, or where to place the prepositions. The unconscious part of your brain handles all of that for you. It ensures that your speech follows the grammar rules without you having to think about them. This process is automatic and seamless. However, what happens when someone who is very focused on grammar, let's call them a grammar nerd, tries to speak English? The conscious part of their brain now has to focus on both the information they want to communicate and the grammar at the same time. This means they're trying to do two things simultaneously, which is incredibly difficult. As a result, their speech becomes slow, hesitant, and unnatural. This is why many students, despite knowing all the grammar rules, struggle to speak English fluently. They're relying too much on their conscious knowledge, which is not suited for spontaneous conversation. How to build unconscious knowledge, unconscious learning. So what's the solution? How do you build unconscious knowledge? The answer lies in something called unconscious learning. Unconscious learning is the process of acquiring knowledge without being fully aware that you are learning. In this context, unconscious doesn't mean learning while you sleep. It means that the learning takes place outside of your conscious awareness. You're not actively trying to memorize rules or study the language. Instead, you're learning through exposure and practice, much like how you learned your first language. One of the most effective forms of unconscious learning is through listening to conversations in English. When you listen to English conversations, your goal isn't to study the language, but to understand the content of the conversation. As you listen and focus on the information, the unconscious part of your brain is picking up on the grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and other aspects of the language. You may not be aware of it, but your brain is learning all of these things behind the scenes. How you learned your first language. Think about how you learned your first language as a child. You didn't learn it by studying grammar books or attending classes. You learned it by listening to the people around you, your parents, your family, your friends. You heard them speak the language every day, and over time, your brain started to pick up on the patterns, sounds, and structures of the language. You weren't consciously trying to learn the rules, but your brain was absorbing the language naturally through exposure. This is the same approach you need to take if you want to learn English fluently. You need to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Listen to English conversations, watch English movies and TV shows, listen to English podcasts and audiobooks. The more you expose yourself to the language, the more your brain will absorb it unconsciously. When you learn English unconsciously, you acquire unconscious automatic knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that will allow you to speak English fluently and naturally. On the other hand, when you learn English consciously by studying grammar, you acquire conscious, non-automatic knowledge, which is not very useful for speaking. 2 methods to build unconscious knowledge. There are 2 main methods you can use to build unconscious knowledge in English. These are the methods I used to become fluent, and I highly recommend them. The first method is listening, and the second is input-driven speaking practice. Let's explore each of these methods in detail. Method 1. Listening. Listening is one of the most popular methods for learning English, and for good reason. It's an incredibly powerful way to build unconscious knowledge. But is it really necessary to listen to English if your goal is to improve your speaking? The answer is a resounding yes. Even if improving your listening skills isn't your primary goal, you still need to listen to English regularly if you want to become fluent. Listening is essential because it helps you become familiar with the complexity of the English language. English, like any language, is complex. It has many nuances, variations in pronunciation, intonation, rhythm, and so on. If you don't listen to English regularly, You'll never become familiar with these complexities, and when you try to practice speaking, you'll find yourself getting confused easily. When you listen to English regularly, your brain becomes accustomed to the sounds, rhythms, and patterns of the language. Over time, this familiarity will make it easier for you to speak English without getting confused or hesitating. The more you listen, the more comfortable you'll become with the language, and the easier it will be to speak fluently. Why listening is important. Even if your goal is to improve your speaking, listening is crucial because it exposes you to natural, real-world English. In conversations, people use informal language, slang, idiomatic expressions, and other elements that you might not find in textbooks. By listening to authentic English, you'll become familiar with how native speakers actually use the language in everyday situations. Listening also helps you internalize grammar rules, vocabulary, and sentence structures without consciously studying them. When you listen to a lot of English, your brain starts to recognize patterns and rules automatically. You may not be able to explain the grammar rule behind a certain sentence, but you'll know it's correct because you've heard similar sentences many times before. This is how you build unconscious knowledge. Effective listening practice. To get the most out of your listening practice, it's important to choose content that is appropriate for your level. If you're a beginner, start with simple conversations, podcasts, or videos designed for English learners. As you become more comfortable, gradually move on to more complex content like news broadcasts, TV shows, and movies. It's also important to listen to a variety of different voices and accents. English is spoken by people all over the world, and there are many different accents and dialects. By exposing yourself to different accents, you'll become more adaptable and confident in your listening and speaking abilities. Method 2. Input-driven speaking practice. The second method for building unconscious knowledge is input-driven speaking practice. This method involves using the language input you've received from listening to create your own spoken output. In other words, after you've listened to a lot of English, you start practicing speaking by using the words, phrases, and sentence structures you've heard. Input-driven speaking practice is different from traditional speaking practice, where you try to create sentences from scratch. Instead, you're using the language that you've absorbed from your listening practice. This approach is much more effective because it allows you to rely on the unconscious knowledge you've built up, rather than trying to construct sentences consciously. How to practice input-driven speaking. To practice input-driven speaking, start by repeating sentences or phrases that you've heard in your listening practice. You can do this by listening to a sentence or phrase, pausing the audio, and then repeating what you've heard. This helps you get used to the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation of English. As you become more comfortable, try to create your own sentences using the words and phrases you've learned from your listening practice. For example, if you heard the phrase, "I'm going to the store," you could create a similar sentence like, "I'm going to the park." The key is to use the language you've already absorbed, rather than trying to invent new sentences from scratch. Benefits of input-driven speaking. Input-driven speaking practice is incredibly effective because it builds on the unconscious knowledge you've acquired through listening. It allows you to speak more fluently and naturally because you're not trying to think about grammar rules or sentence structures consciously. Instead, you're drawing on the patterns and structures that your brain has already internalized. This method also helps you become more confident in your speaking abilities. Because you're using language that you've already heard and understood, you'll feel more comfortable and less hesitant when speaking. Over time, this will lead to greater fluency and more natural speech. The power of practice. Asterisk. It's important to remember that building unconscious knowledge in English takes time and practice. You won't become fluent overnight, but if you consistently listen to English and practice input-driven speaking, you will see significant improvements in your fluency over time. One of the most powerful aspects of these methods is that they don't require you to leave your home or take expensive language courses. You can practice listening and input-driven speaking on your own from anywhere in the world. All you need is access to English content and the motivation to practice regularly. Conclusion. If you want to speak English fluently, you need to focus on building unconscious knowledge. This is the key to speaking naturally and effortlessly without having to think about grammar or sentence structures. The best way to build this kind of knowledge is through unconscious learning, which can be achieved through listening and input-driven speaking practice. By immersing yourself in English and practicing these methods regularly, you can achieve fluency without ever leaving your home. Remember, the journey to fluency takes time and effort, but it is definitely achievable. If I was able to do it, so can you. Keep practicing, stay motivated, and you'll see the results. Thank you for watching, and I hope these tips help you on your journey to English fluency. Good luck!